She pressed her back against the cold stone pillar of the private elevator bay, every muscle in her body locked rigid with fear. "Don't," Fern breathed, the single syllable barely louder than the hum of the heating vents overhead. "Please just don't touch me." Rhett Duvall's hand stopped in midair. He had been reaching toward her to steady her. She'd stumbled coming off the elevator, her legs unreliable after what had happened in the parking structure, but the raw, animal terror in her voice turned him to stone. His steel-grey eyes moved from her face to her hands, to the way she'd drawn them tightly against her chest, and then he saw them. The bruises, dark and livid against her pale wrists and forearms, already purpling into the deep, ugly color of serious damage. 5 distinct finger marks on her left arm, a grip hard enough to leave a signature in her skin. When Rhett Duvall spoke again, his voice had dropped to something barely above a murmur, and somehow that quiet made it more frightening than a shout. "Tell me who did that to you." Fern Whitacre had spent 11 years in financial forensics, learning to be invisible. It was a specific kind of skill, one that no accounting program formally taught, but that every woman who worked in the shadow of corporate giants eventually mastered on her own. She knew how to sit in a glass-walled conference room full of men in $2,000 suits and make herself small enough that their eyes slid over her the way water slid over polished stone. She knew how to present her findings with the dispassion of a surgeon reading an X-ray. No inflection that might be mistaken for emotion. No personality that might remind anyone in the room that she was a person and not merely a function. And in those 11 years it had worked. She was good at fading. She was comfortable in the corner of the frame, occupying her space without demanding anyone acknowledge it. Her tote bag was sensible. Her cardigans were oversized and soft, and designed to do exactly what she needed them to do, which was to minimize. She had learned long ago that people, certain kinds of people in certain kinds of rooms, didn't take well to a woman who looked like her standing too firmly in her own skin. So she didn't. She kept her head down. She did the work. She let the numbers speak. And numbers, unlike people, never lied. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, Lake Michigan whipping up a gray, furious chop outside the 42nd floor windows of Duvall Capital Partners, when Fern found the discrepancy. She wasn't supposed to be there in any meaningful sense. She'd been contracted from outside, a 3-week forensic audit of the firm's municipal pension fund accounts, a regulatory formality that Duvall's compliance team had flagged for the 3rd quarter. The partners hadn't been pleased about it. She'd felt their irritation like a low-grade hum in the air. Every time she walked down the corridor toward the windowless audit room they'd assigned her, the contractor, the necessary inconvenience, the woman in the oversized cardigan, who could be trusted to sign the forms and leave. She'd found the irregularity on day 9, buried in a stack of third-party transfer confirmations that were technically within compliance parameters, but logistically and wasn't possible. 47 municipal pension accounts across 6 states, all showing quarterly disbursements to a single third-party administrator, Halloran Asset Management, LLC, standard on paper, except that Halloran Asset Management, LLC, per the Secretary of State records Fern had pulled at midnight on her personal laptop, had been dissolved 18 months earlier. The money wasn't going to Halloran. It was going somewhere else. $63 million over 14 quarters, moving through a ghost company into. She'd traced it through 4 more layers before she had to stop herself, her hands shaking over the keyboard, into a private holding entity registered in the Cayman Islands. Someone at Duvall Capital was stealing from public pension funds, from teachers, from city workers, from people who had spent 30 years doing the right thing and were waiting on that money to retire. Fern sat in the dark of the audit room for a long time after she made the discovery, the glow of her monitor the only light. Then she packed everything onto a personal encrypted drive, every transfer confirmation, every shell company registration, every routing number, tucked it into the inner pocket of her tote bag, and went to find Rex Granger. Rex was her point of contact at Duvall. He was the executive vice president of fund operations, the person the partners had designated to liaise with her, to answer her questions, to make sure she had what she needed, and nothing more. He was a lean, sharp-featured man with a real estate attorney's smile and the kind of easy authority that came from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. She found him alone in the underground parking structure, heading toward his car, and she told him what she'd found. She laid it out calmly and completely, the way she would present any finding. Here is the anomaly. Here are the supporting documents. Here is the logical conclusion. She expected him to go pale. She expected him to thank her. She expected him to say they needed to take this immediately to Rhett Duvall himself. Rex Granger's face did go pale, and then it went something else entirely. He closed the distance between them in 3 strides. His hand shot out and caught both her wrists before she could step back, yanking her toward him so hard the air left her lungs in a single violent rush. "Listen to me very carefully," Rex said, his voice low and strange and nothing like the boardroom voice she'd been listening to for 9 days. His grip on her wrists tightened until she felt the bones protest. "You did not find anything. Whatever you think you found, it was a clerical error in their system, not ours. You are going to go back up there. You are going to close your files. And you are going to write a clean report. And then you are going to walk out of this building. And you are never going to speak about this to anyone." She tried to pull back, his grip tightened. "If you don't," Rex said, "you will not finish the drive home tonight. Do you understand me? I am not making a threat. I am giving you information." He shoved her backward. She hit the concrete support pillar with her shoulder blades, pain flaring white through her upper back. By the time she caught her breath, Rex was in his car, reversing out of his space with his eyes fixed straight ahead, as though she were already a problem he'd resolved. Fern stood in the parking structure for a very long time. Then she straightened her cardigan, adjusted the strap of her tote bag against the ache in her shoulder, and took the elevator back upstairs, not to the audit room, but to the 42nd floor lobby. She asked to see Rhett Duvall. She had not expected him to agree. She had certainly not expected it to happen in less than 4 minutes. The assistant who collected her from the lobby moved through the corridors of the executive floor like a current of air, unhurried and inevitable. Fern followed her past glass-walled conference rooms, past the low murmur of conversations she wasn't supposed to hear, to a set of floor-to-ceiling mahogany doors at the far end. Rhett Duvall's office faced east, and on a clear day it probably looked out over the whole of the waterfront. Today the view was nothing but cloud and dark water, Lake Michigan churning below like something ancient and restless. The man himself was standing at the window when she was shown in. Fern had done her due diligence before this engagement, which meant she'd seen the photographs, magazine profiles, the board announcements, the occasional appearance in the Tribune's business section. She had thought she was prepared. She hadn't been. Rhett Duvall was 44 and built like someone who had grown up working with his hands before he learned to work with his mind. He was broad across the shoulders and lean at the waist, and he wore a charcoal suit that had been cut specifically for his frame with the kind of quiet precision that communicated vast amounts of money without displaying a single visible logo. His jaw was angular, his hair dark with threads of silver at the temples, and when he turned from the window and his eyes settled on her, Fern understood viscerally why people found him intimidating. It wasn't the money. It wasn't the power, exactly. It was the quality of his attention. When Rhett Duvall looked at a person, he looked at them completely, and there was something almost uncomfortable about being seen that thoroughly. "Miss Whitacre," he said. His voice was low and even. "You ask for me directly. That doesn't happen." She had prepared what she was going to say. She had organized it the way she organized everything, logically, sequentially, without unnecessary ornamentation. But she had made it halfway through the anteroom before the adrenaline began to crash, and now, standing in front of him, she realized her hands were shaking inside the sleeves of her cardigan. She clutched her tote bag against her side. Rhett's gaze dropped to the movement, just for a fraction of a second, and she watched something shift behind his expression. He began to walk toward her. That was when she stepped back. Her shoulder blades found the cold stone face of the pillar beside the elevator bay, and before she could stop herself, the words came out. "Don't, please, just don't touch me." The silence that followed felt like pressure. Rhett Duvall stood exactly where he'd stopped, his right hand still extended slightly in the air between them. He didn't advance. He didn't retreat. He waited with the stillness of someone who had learned that patience, deployed correctly, was its own kind of force. His gaze moved to her wrists. The cardigan had ridden up when she pressed herself against the pillar, and the cuffs had pulled back, and what he could see of her forearms made the line of his jaw go very hard. "Tell me," he said quietly, "who did that to you?" The gentleness of it undid her more than anger would have. Fern had braced herself for frustration, for impatience, for the polite dismissal she was so accustomed to from men in this building. She had not braced herself for that voice, careful and low, asking the question like it was the only thing that mattered in the room. "Rex Granger," she said, "your EVP of Fund Operations." She paused. "I found something in the audit. I went to him first because I was following protocol. She stopped, started again. He told me to delete my findings and write a clean report, and then he grabbed me in the parking garage." Something in Rhett's face went absolutely still. "He also told me I wouldn't make it home tonight if I didn't comply," Fern added. She'd meant her voice to be steady. It almost was. Rhett didn't raise his voice. He didn't move dramatically. He simply turned his head a fraction and said, "Hollis." A man Fern hadn't noticed materialized near the door. He was built like a shipping container and dressed like a banker. "Find Rex Granger now. Don't let him make any calls." "Yes, sir." The man was gone before Fern had fully registered that he'd been there. Rhett turned back to her. When he moved toward her this time, it was slowly, with a deliberateness that telegraphed every step in advance. He stopped a full arm's length away, crouched down slightly so their eyes were level, and held out his hand palm up, not touching her. "Can I see?" he asked. She stared at his open hand for a long moment. Then, very slowly, she pulled back her sleeve and laid her wrist across his palm. She heard the controlled breath he drew in through his nose when he saw the full extent of the bruising. His thumb hovered a careful millimeter above her skin, not touching, just tracing the shape of the damage in the air above it. "You said you found something," he said. His voice was measured. Controlled, but beneath it was something that vibrated at a very low frequency, like a piano string held down after the key has been struck. Fern reached into the inner pocket of her tote bag with her free hand and produced the encrypted drive. $63 million, she said. 14 quarters. 47 municipal pension accounts rerouted through a dissolved shell company into a Cayman Islands holding entity. She paused. Someone in this firm has been stealing retirement money from public employees for 3.5 years. Rhett looked at the drive in her hand. Then he looked at her. At her face, at the cardigan she'd drawn tight around herself, at the way she'd been holding her whole body like something that expected to be struck again. "You came straight to me," he said. "Rex told me not to, so yes." Something moved behind his eyes. "You did the right thing, Fern." He said her name like he'd been saying it for years. "And you are not going home tonight." She told herself it was reasonable to be frightened. The car that took them from the building was an armored SUV with tinted windows, and the man driving it hadn't introduced himself, and Rhett sat beside her, issuing a series of quiet, decisive instructions into his phone that she could tell by tone, if not by content, were the kinds of instructions that changed things irrevocably. She pressed herself against the far side of the seat and stared out the window at the river as they crossed the bridge into River North. "You can relax," Rhett said quietly. He had ended the call. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the street ahead, but something in the set of his shoulders had changed, less strategic, almost tired. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you." "You don't know me," Fern said. It came out smaller than she intended. "I know you spent 9 days in an audit room you were treated like a nuisance for occupying, that you tracked $63 million through 5 layers of shell architecture on your own time, and that when a man twice your size threatened your life, you still walked up to the 42nd floor and told the truth." He glanced at her then, briefly. "I know enough." She didn't have an answer for that. The building they arrived at was on the river, glass and concrete, understated from the outside in the way that only very expensive buildings are understated. The private elevator required a biometric key. The floor it opened onto was a single sweeping residence. Floor-to-ceiling windows facing the Chicago River, the kitchen a long expanse of matte black stone and professional-grade appliances, the furniture the kind built for comfort rather than appearances. "This is my private residence," Rhett said, shrugging out of his suit jacket. 4 people in the world know it exists. My head of security, my personal attorney, my CFO, and now you." He disappeared into a bathroom and returned with a small medical kit. Professional grade, the kind stocked by people who don't always have the option of waiting for an ambulance. He sat beside her on the wide, low sofa, leaving 2 deliberate feet of space between them, and set the kit on the cushion. "May I?" He gestured toward her wrists. She nodded. Fern had made a practice of not looking directly at herself in situations where her body became the subject. She had learned this in her 20s, across a series of clinical and professional contexts where the presence of her size in the frame seemed to complicate things for everyone involved. She looked at the river instead, at the iron-grey light of the October afternoon, while Rhett worked in concentrated silence, applying an arnica gel to her wrists with the focused attention of someone diffusing something fragile. "I'm sorry," she said. She wasn't sure what she was apologizing for. Rhett paused. "What for?" "For being in your apartment, for whatever this is going to cost you." She glanced down at herself, the oversized cardigan, the worn flats, the full, soft shape of herself taking up space on his bespoke sofa. "I'm not exactly who you'd picture in a situation like this." "Like what?" She gestured vaguely, the person at the center of something. Rhett was quiet for a moment. Then he said very simply, "I've been in rooms full of people who looked exactly the part and had nothing worth looking at. And I've been in rooms with one person in a cardigan who could see what 60 other people missed." He held her gaze. "Who do you think I'd rather have at the center of something?" Fern looked at the river and said nothing. But something in her chest loosened, incrementally, like a knot that had been there so long she'd mistaken it for structure. His CFO arrived 2 hours later. Martin Soul was 61 years old, silver-haired, patrician, and had co-founded Duvall Capital Partners with Rhett 15 years earlier when Rhett was 29, and Martin was the only man in Chicago willing to bet on a kid from Pilsen with $200,000, and an instinct that the rest of the world hadn't learned to trust yet. There was a photo of them in the Tribune from 2011 that Fern had seen in her background research. The 2 of them grinning outside the original office in the West Loop, looking like men who had no idea how large the thing they were building was going to become. Martin greeted Rhett with the ease of long familiarity, accepted an introduction to Fern with a warm handshake, and settled into the armchair across from her with the gravity of a man who understood that something serious was being laid at his feet. Fern walked him through the findings. She had them committed to memory at this point, every routing number, every transfer date, every layer of the architecture. When she finished, the room was quiet. Martin Soul laced his fingers together and said, "This is devastating." "It's a crime," Rhett said. "Yes, absolutely." Martin nodded slowly. I need to be the one to tell you this before you take it to the FBI, Rhett. You need to understand that moving on this will expose the firm to significant regulatory scrutiny, regardless of where the liability ultimately. Martin, Rhett's voice was quiet. These are pension accounts, teachers, sanitation workers, people who trusted us with 30 years of their working lives. Martin was silent for a moment. Of course, he said. Of course, you're right. But something about the way he said it made the fine hairs on the back of Fern's neck rise. She studied the man. At the particular way, he was not looking at the encrypted drive sitting on the coffee table. At the small muscle that had tightened and released along his jaw when she'd read out the specific routing number for the Cayman account. Not at the amount, not at the name of the shell company, but at that number specifically. The kind of recognition that only came from having typed something yourself, hundreds of times, until it lived in your hands. She knew that tell. She'd spent 11 years learning to read them. After Martin left, with a promise to coordinate with legal counsel first thing in the morning, Fern sat for a long time in the quiet of the apartment, watching the river lights come on below. "It's him," she said. Rhett turned from the window. "Martin." She chose her words carefully. "I don't have proof yet." But when I read out the Cayman routing number, his jaw tightened. Not at the amount, not at the shell company name, at that specific string of digits, which is something you'd only recognize if you'd typed it yourself. The look on Rhett Duvall's face in that moment was one of the harder things Fern had ever witnessed. Not surprise, something older than surprise. The particular grief of a betrayal you'd already half known was coming, but had chosen not to look at directly. 15 years, a photo in the Tribune, 2 men grinning outside a West Loop office. "How long do you need," he said finally, "to find the proof?" "Give me access to the administrative back end of the transfer records, a forensic copy of the general ledger, and 6 hours. He looked at her. "You'll have it in 20 minutes. She had the proof in 4. Martin Soule had been meticulous, routing the money through enough intermediaries that it looked like diffusion, like systemic error, like anything but deliberate theft. But the authorization timestamps embedded in each outbound instruction all traced back to a single administrative credentials set that had been issued in Martin's name 15 years ago and never formally signed. He had signed every transaction himself. He had simply used a permissions loophole that no one had ever thought to audit, because no one had ever imagined that the man who built the permissions architecture would one day need to steal from his own firm. Fern compiled the documentation into a format the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit could process directly. Her hands were steady, her mind, in the way it always was, when she was deep inside a problem, was clear and fast and absolutely certain of itself. This was her domain. The numbers said what they said. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation, no way to argue with the shape of what Martin Soule had done. She was transferring the final file package to the encrypted drive when the power died. Not a breaker, everything at once. Lights, appliances, the low ambient hum of the building's climate system. Darkness, total and immediate, and then, from somewhere below, a percussive concussion she felt in her sternum before she heard it with her ears. Rhett moved in the dark before she could process what was happening. His arm came around her from behind, solid and unambiguous, pulling her back from the desk. "Stay low," he said, controlled. "Hollis." "Already moving," a voice said from somewhere to her left. The apartment's emergency lighting came up, dim amber strips along the baseboards, and in that half-dark she could see Rhett's security team moving into positions she hadn't previously known existed. She could hear feet on the emergency stairwell. Multiple sets, heavy and deliberate, and not trying to be quiet about it. Hollis appeared at Rhett's side. 6 on the stairs, 2 more in the lobby. Building security is compromised. It's a sole operation. Rhett's expression didn't change. "Get her out through the river access." "I have to finish the transfer," Fern said. Fern. 30 seconds. She turned back to the laptop, Her hands moved. She had done this kind of thing, extracting structured data under pressure, finishing work while everything collapsed around her, in conference rooms and audit suites and situations that had felt like emergencies but were only professional ones. The physical fear she pushed to the back of the room. The work came forward. I'm sending the full package to the FBI Financial Crimes tip line and a secondary copy to the U.S. Attorney's Office. If we don't make it out, the evidence is already delivered. "We are going to make it out," Rhett said, in a voice that left no grammatical room for argument. The door to the stairwell burst inward. What followed was 20 seconds of compressed chaos that Fern would spend a long time afterward trying to reassemble in any coherent order. She remembered Hollis putting his body between her and the door. She remembered Rhett moving, fast and precise and economical, the kind of movement that told you immediately that his stillness in ordinary life was a choice, not a natural state. She remembered the amber light flickering and the cold of the hallway wall against her shoulder, and the sounds of a confrontation she was trying very hard not to look at directly. She also remembered the moment Hollis went down. Not seriously. A blow to the back of his knee that buckled him sideways, but enough. The man in tactical gear who stepped over him was already raising what was in his hand, already angling toward Rhett's exposed back, and Hollis was down and Rhett hadn't seen it yet, and Fern's mind computed all of this in the span of approximately one breath. She had never been brave in any cinematic sense. She was not a fighter, she was 5'4", and had spent her entire adult life making herself smaller in rooms that didn't want her taking up space. She did not think, she moved. She drove her full weight sideways into the man's shoulder an instant before he could fire. They hit the wall together, hard, and she had just enough time to register the surprise in his eyes, not at the threat, but at its source, before Hollis, recovered, handled the rest. She ended up on the floor. Her knee was going to bruise impressively. The world had a soft, spinning quality at its edges. Fern. Rhett was there, kneeling, his hands at her face, her shoulders. "Look at me." She looked at him. "The transfer went through," she said, "before the door came in. The FBI already has everything." He closed his eyes for one full second. When he opened them again, something was in them that she hadn't seen there before, something stripped of the controlled, executive distance he'd maintained since the moment she'd walked into his office. You could have been killed. Hollis was going to be shot. That's his job. You keep saying that like it's supposed to make me feel differently about it. Rhett looked at her for a long moment in the amber emergency light, the apartment quiet now around them in the way that rooms go quiet after something significant has finished happening in them. Then his hand came up to the side of her face, slowly, telegraphing the movement the way he'd learned to telegraph all of them around her. And this time she didn't flinch. She leaned into it, just slightly, the way you lean into warmth when you've been cold for a long time without quite knowing it. "I have spent 15 years, Rhett said, trusting the wrong person. A man I built everything with who I thought understood what this firm was supposed to mean." His thumb traced a careful arc along her cheekbone. "And in 9 days, you sat in a room no one wanted you in, found what 60 other people missed, and then, when a man put his hands on you and told you your life was forfeit for knowing it, you still came upstairs and told the truth." He paused. "And then you threw yourself at an armed man to protect someone you met this morning." "I was terrified both times," Fern said. "I know." His forehead came to rest against hers, deliberate and steady. "That's not incompatible with courage. It's the definition of it." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the blown door, the city continued its business. Sirens rising in the distance, the river moving in the dark below, the whole enormous machinery of Chicago carrying on regardless. The files were delivered. The evidence was irrevocable. What Martin Soule had spent 3.5 years constructing with such meticulous care was already, as of 11:47 p.m., on a Tuesday in October, beginning to come apart. "I have a cat," she said, "in Portland. His name is Clive." She felt Rhett's breath change, the slight hitch of someone who had been braced for something heavier and received something entirely different. "What does Clive have to do with anything?" he said, but there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before, something that sounded distantly like relief. "I was just thinking," Fern said, "about logistics." Martin Soule was arrested at O'Hare the following morning, 40 minutes before his flight to Zurich boarded. Rex Granger had cooperated in full by midnight. The immunity conversation had apparently taken less than 12 minutes. Fern found out about both through a text from an unlisted number she didn't yet have saved, but that she recognized immediately by the economy of its language and the precision of its information. She was sitting at the kitchen island of a hotel suite Rhett's team had arranged, a mug of coffee warming her hands, watching the first pale light of morning come up over the city. She had a flight home to Portland booked for that afternoon. She had a lease. She had Clive, and a very good coffee grinder, and a practice she'd spent years building with her own hands, and none of it required her to be in Chicago. Her phone rang. "I need a complete independent forensic audit," Rhett said without preamble. "Every active fund account, every pension structure, every quarter for the past 5 years. I need it done by someone I can trust completely, who has already demonstrated that she can find what no one else is looking for." A pause that was not quite a pause. The engagement would be substantial. It would require relocation to Chicago for a minimum of 6 months. Fern looked out the window at the city coming awake below her. 6 months, she said. Minimum. She thought about the corner cubicle in Portland, the conference rooms where she'd spent 11 years folding herself small, the specific practiced skill of making sure her presence in a room didn't cost anyone anything. She thought about a man who had crouched down to be eye level with her and asked, with no transaction behind the question, whether he could see her wrists. "The permissions architecture that Soule exploited is a systemic vulnerability," she said. "It's not a Martin problem, it's a structural one. If I'm doing this engagement, I'm rebuilding the entire audit control framework, not just finding what he took. That's what I'm asking for. And I need a real office with windows. I'll have it ready before you land." Fern set her coffee mug down on the counter and watched a tugboat push its slow way up the river below, the water gray and bright at the same time in the early light, the way Chicago water was in October. She thought about $63 million and 47 pension accounts, and a woman in an oversized cardigan sitting in a room where no one had expected her to find anything. She thought about what it felt like to be looked at by someone who was not performing patience, who was not managing her, who simply looked and saw what was actually there. "Clive is going to need transport arrangements," she said. "Already handled," Rhett said. She pressed her lips together. Outside, the city continued becoming itself in the morning light, indifferent and enormous, and full of the kind of problems that only got solved when someone decided to sit down and look at them honestly. The full scope of what Martin Soule had built would take months to unwind. Federal prosecutors, civil remediation, the careful, painstaking work of tracing what could still be recovered and returning it to the people it had been taken from. Fern knew this. She had done this kind of work before, in smaller theaters, with smaller stakes. She knew the shape of what it required. What she had not done before, in 11 years of keeping her head down and her shoulders small, and her presence as unbothered as possible, was walk toward the hardest version of a problem, feeling like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She ended the call. She finished her coffee. She opened her laptop and began drafting the scope of work. Outside, Chicago went on being Chicago, gray and brilliant and very much alive, and somewhere on the 42nd floor of a building overlooking the lake, an office with windows was waiting for her.